please, colleagues? Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good day. Welcome to the first webinar of the series Sustainable Transport and COVID-19 Response and Recovery. My name is Nayara Costa. I'm a Senior Sustainable Development Officer at the Division for Sustainable Development Goals at UNDESA, and I'm honored to be the moderator of this session today. Before we begin, I would like to provide some housekeeping announcements. So this call is being recorded, and then the link to the recording and as well as the PowerPoint presentation, they will be shared and posted online very shortly at our website. We also kindly ask all the panelists to mute their microphones and turn their cameras off if they are not speaking. Participants, you will be able to use the chat box and the Q&A boxes to make comments during the whole duration of the webinar. We will be monitoring the chat box and we will be trying to accommodate as many questions and inputs as possible during the webinar. We also invite our speakers to, if possible, to keep an eye on the Q&A in case there are information you can already share and update. Also to the participants, you can use the chat box to share information, resources, or link to any materials that you also would like to share. We would like to invite all of you, if you are using social media, to follow, you can tag our Twitter @SustDev and also use the hashtag sustainable transport. We will now start the opening remarks for this webinar. And without further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Alex Trepokov, Officer in Charge of the Division for Sustainable Development Goals of UNDESA, for some introductory remarks. And Mr. Trepokov, he will also introduce the high-level speaker of this opening session. Mr. Trepokov, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Nayara. Distinguished participants, dear colleagues and friends, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, I wish to thank all participants for joining this webinar entitled Sustainable Transport and COVID-19 Responses and Recovery. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused a global crisis with direct adverse effects on all modes of transport and travel, as well as many associated sectors. Disruptions in tourism, global supply chains, and labor movements are most evident, resulting in drastic economic slowdown, high unemployment, and increased income inequality. Prospects for a quick recovery remain highly uncertain. At the same time, the pandemic may open opportunities for longer-term changes in both supply and demand for transport services, accelerating a transition to more sustainable transport systems. And in post-pandemic recovery period, there is a potential for sustainable transport solutions. Ensuring human safety and security, social inclusiveness and affordability, economic efficiency and environmental sustainability of transport systems would be a major contribution to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. This webinar seeks to display current thinking on recent developments related to COVID-19 and sustainable transport, and to outline options for the way forward toward a robust recovery. Today's program consists of two panels focusing on country experiences and policy measures to address COVID-19 impact on sustainable transport on one hand, and exploring the impact of COVID-19 on people and planet as seen through the transport lens on the other. The outcome of our discussions will inform substantive preparations for the forthcoming second United Nations Global Sustainable Transport Conference to be held in Beijing, China. In light of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, new dates are currently under consideration and will be announced on the conference website. With a view to keeping the momentum, UNDESA has been working with many partners within and outside the United Nations system, including for the organization of this two-part webinar in order to connect, mobilize, and bring new ideas from all relevant stakeholders. The second part of this webinar will take place next week on the 1st of July, and all are welcome to register. Today, we are privileged to have a group of distinguished speakers and colleagues whose expertise will be very valuable to our work. We look forward to hearing your views, ideas, and suggestions. Without further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Liu Zhenmin, Under-Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs of the United Nations, to deliver this keynote opening remarks. Mr. Liu, you have the floor.
Thank you, Alex. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all colleagues. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this important webinar on sustainable transport and COVID-19. Sustainable transport is well recognized as one of the key enablers of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. It is in recognition of such importance that the second Global Sustainable Transport Conference was scheduled to be held in Beijing this year by the Secretary General. The COVID-19 pandemic has forced a temporary postponement, but it has also brought to the forefront just how vital this subject is for poverty eradication, economic growth, human development, and sustainability. By allowing for the mobility of people and goods, it improves lives and livelihoods and enables access to basic services such as health, education, and finance. There are many challenges too. Nearly a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions come from transport, and these emissions are projected to grow significantly in the years to come. Other pollutants, most obviously in cities, directly impact health. In remote areas, lack of access is a challenge, and a rising number of accidents contributes to increasing number of deaths. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic continues to take a terrible human toll. At the same time, as governments and individuals take unprecedented steps to control the spread, we are seeing impacts across multiple sustainable development goals. Many of these steps have involved travel or movement restrictions of one kind or another. We must recognize that in the absence of vaccines or other effective treatments, these measures, when properly implemented, have been managed to reduce the spread and cut the toll of deaths. But they have also had very significant adverse effects. Current assessments are for global GDP to shrink by over 5% and for tens of millions to fall into extreme poverty. Impacts are magnified in the transport sector. For example, it is estimated that there will be about 2.5 billion fewer air travelers in 2020. The global economic downturn is also reflected in dropping foreign freight shipments, with the international shipping rates in some countries down by as much as 70%. In many cities, revenues from public transit are so low that there are concerns about their continuing financial health. Job losses in all transport-related sectors, including those such as tourism, are evident. This is especially difficult as many of these jobs and livelihoods are ways out of poverty for many, including women. Disrupted supply chains and the labor movement also hamper production and endanger food security. As during early crises marked by the global economic slowdowns, there are short-term reductions in greenhouse gases and other pollutants. However, prior experiences shows that these might be rapidly reversed when the situation returns to normal. At the same time, the pandemic could increase the impetus towards implementing shared solutions for other universal challenges, such as climate change. There could be longer-term changes in both demand and supply for transport services as well. Alternate modes of working and learning, such as telecommuting and e-learning, and the rise of walking and bicycling, can all transform transport services. In addition, planned reductions in passenger density to diminish the risk of community transmission of diseases could significantly change how many travel services are offered. Ladies and gentlemen, in order to meet the increasing and changing transport demands while preserving the planet for current and future generations, we will have to change the way we plan, develop, and use transport modes and systems. The recovery period from the pandemic offers a unique opportunity to do this. We know what transitions to sustainable transport would look like. This is time to make them happen. I consider this to be an important aspect of our discussions today and the next week. The pandemic is a chance for all actors to rethink the transport of passengers and goods and come up with solutions. We need to think of solutions that can withstand possible future crises of this nature. We also need to support the achievement of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement. I'm happy to see that the program for the webinar creates space for such a discussion. The United Nations system stands ready to support member states and other stakeholders in these trying times. The Secretary General has advanced several initiatives in this regard. My department, the UNDESA, has been undertaking analytical work with regards to the impact of COVID-19 on sustainable development. We have published several policy briefs, including on the impact on countries in special situations. A policy brief on sustainable transport, which will also touch on the impact of COVID-19 and the related responses and recovery, is planned for later this year. Our capacity building exercises also accommodate responses to COVID-19, and expect that our discussions here, even in virtual format, will strengthen the foundation for the second Global Sustainable Transport Conference. New dates for the conference are currently being considered and will be announced through the conference website. Dear colleagues, the need for sustainable transport systems that have no one left behind and are inclusive, affordable, efficient, environmental friendly, and safe is more apparent than ever. let us use this moment to find concrete solutions to enhancing sustainable transport worldwide as a crucial enabler of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and Paris Agreement. I wish this would be a great success. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Liu, for your insightful keynote remarks. We thus concluded the opening of our webinar, and I am happy to invite my colleague, Nayara Costa, to take back the microphone as she will be guiding us through the rest of today's meeting. Nayara, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. We will now start our first panel, Country Experiences and Policy Measures to Address COVID-19 Impacts on Sustainable Transport. We have two speakers, and there will be one lead discussant. Unfortunately, one of our discussants didn't make to the webinar today. The speakers will be allocated around 7 to 8 minutes, and the discussant, I'll give 3 minutes, considering that we will only have one. I will be showing a sign indicating when there is only 1 minute left for each speaker. While the speakers are making the presentations, we encourage all participants to use the chat box and the Q&A to include your questions, your comments, your suggestions, but do please remember to include your name, your organization, and your country. And if possible, when you are putting a question up on the Q&A or the chat box, indicate the speaker you are addressing your question to. So without further ado, we want to invite our first speaker. It is Mr. Li Yang, Director General for International Cooperation of the Ministry of Transport of China, to deliver his remarks. Can we move the presenter right to DG Li, please?
Thank you.
Mr. Li, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Dear distinguished Undersecretary Mr. Liu Zhenmin, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, it's my pleasure to attend this webinar to share with you the experience of China's transport industry in fighting coronavirus, and to discuss how to deal with the challenge to the sustainable transport development. Today, my colleague and I would like to talk about 3 issues: China's action, international cooperation, and follow-up actions. First, China actions. Let's take a first look at the 5 stages of fight COVID-19 in China. Because of time limited, if you have any interest, you can look at the Chinese government white book, Fighting COVID-19 China in Action. We just take a first look at the 5 stages, and then the experience of China's transport sector in the fight against COVID-19. My colleague and I would call our experience cares, keep, cares, C, cut off, keep the virus in check, allocate, keep essential allocation efficient, reopen, keep full transport service available, expedite, keep the PPE transport delivery priority, and supply chain, keep the international supply chain unimpeded. Cut off, keep the virus in check. Since the outbreak of COVID-19, we immediately blocked the transmission of a virus in China. Guideline on COVID-19 prevention and control concerning vehicle, works, and stations in road freight transport was issued by my ministry. We introduced a region-specific, multi-leveled virus prevention and control measures in China. Hygiene and quarantine enhanced for transport service nationwide. Measures such as improvement of hygiene conditions, disinfection, ventilation, checking points at the entry and exit were put in place in the public facility such as train station, airport, and port terminal. The taking of temperature and wearing of masks become mandatory to gain access to the facilities. Allocate. It's necessary to deliver at the right time, right place in this hard period. A task force of ministry for emergency supplies was set up to ensure the supply of PPE and daily essential at the right time. For instance, from January to June, about 1 million tons of epidemic prevention materials and daily essentials were transported from across the country to Hubei, the serious province in China. Bulk goods such as coal and fuel totaling 4.2 million tons were also shipped. Sufficient supplies ensure the normal functioning of society in Hubei province. Reopen. As the pandemic abated, we faced in the reopen of economy. We help workers back to factories and construction sites through provision of point-to-point transport service by chartering coaches, trains, and planes. We helped business reopen by delivery of PPE and facilitation of people movement as well. We also introduced the favorable policy, such as highway toll relief, to reduce the cost of logistics. Expedite. During fighting against coronavirus, we always put the track of PPE and delivery essentials priority. All these cars, no stop, no inspection, and no toll at checking point of expressway in order to save time and save lives. Supply. We keep the international supply chain unimpeded. Because PPE such as masks was needed to travel global from China to the other countries. And as you know, because of the travel restrictions, a lot of air flights were canceled, and we lack a lot of capacity of the air flight. And we facilitated the air passenger flights to transfer to air cargo flights. And we issued the policy to improve the customers' clearance measures for international air cargo crew. Just because all these measures, and we keep the logistic service stable, and we keep the people alive to back to normal. Now we move to the second issue, international cooperation. China values the understanding and the support of the international community when China was in struggle against COVID-19. From the beginning, we exchanged and cooperated with the international community and shared information and experience to contribute to the global fighting against coronavirus. We work closely with the International Maritime Organization, IMO, International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, etc., to share our best experience. Totally, we have 5 major platforms, and you can, from my presentation, and we did a lot of work, and by this help of this international opposition. Thank you. Thanks very much. The third and the last issue, follow-up actions. COVID-19 poses huge challenge to the international community. Just as opening remarks of Mr. Liu Zhiming, there are a lot of influence the long-term development of the transport industry. The world economy is facing the risk of deep recession. The induced lack of demand for international transport will have the lasting impact on the growth of transport industry. With the perceived long stagnation of aviation industry and the prolonged recovery of shipping industry, the supply chain will be more localized, regionalized, and diverse. Therefore, in order to achieve better response and economic recovery, we should first strengthen connectivity and cooperation in the transport sector. We support the development of a well-connected transport infrastructure network. We encourage all countries to foster the global transport connectivity partnership to establish an unimpeded passage for cross-border movement of people and goods, keeping supply chain and the logistics system smooth and safe. Second, stay committed to the development of sustainable transport. We should adhere to reform and innovation in transport sector and encourage the wide use of new technology and new business model. We should develop digital transport infrastructure, try to build a safe, efficient, inclusive, and sustainable transport system for all in order to enhance the resilience of the transport system against major emergencies such as this global public health crisis. Third, support multilateralism and promote global economic growth. Global challenge call for global solutions. Global mutual assistance and multilateral cooperation are effective ways to fight the pandemic. We support the United Nations, the WHO, MO, ICAO, and other international organizations to play a key role in promoting and coordinating the global transport industry in response to the pandemic and sustainable development. Dear distinguished Secretary Ms. Liu and Mr. Alexander and all their guests, China's President Xi Jinping emphasized, in the face of COVID-19, solidarity and cooperation is our most powerful weapon. We firmly believe human beings are a community of shared future. As long as we strengthen solidarity and cooperation, we will eventually defeat COVID-19 and human society will usher in a better tomorrow of health and sustainable development. We firmly believe that crisis and opportunity always coexist and the crisis will pass. China is ready to work together with the international community to make positive contribution to promoting sustainable development of transport, recovery of global economy, and human well-being. Tomorrow, it's a Chinese traditional holiday we call Dragon Boat Festival. I wish all of you safe and healthy. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Director General Lee. I just want to ask my colleagues to change the, yes, I think I have the control. Just 1 second while we move through the backup slides we had on our system. And so now I want to invite Mr. Daniel Bongard, Program Director of Transport and Climate Change from GIZ. Mr. Bongard, you have the floor, please, and please do indicate whenever you want the slides to move, okay? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation to that very important conference, and thank you giving us the opportunity. I will talk today on some of the Germany's experiences on how we react on the COVID-19 crisis. And I will have a focus on how this also can be harmonized with the global agenda that has been agreed in the Paris Agreement. And so how we, under this special situation, can still also link activities we're now doing as a reaction to the crisis to these long-term goals, because there's also a challenge still up there for the transport sector to really achieve decarbonized transport sector. First of all, my congratulations and really impressive presentation of how China and the Ministry of Transport in China dealt with the crisis. I think you have been affected quite severely and were front runners in reacting on this. So many other countries also looked at China at the time. So what's going on? So this was very interesting, and I think also in Germany, many things have been inspired by actions in China. I work for GIZ, the Journal International Corporation. So we are working on behalf of the German government in more than 120 countries worldwide on different topics. Sustainable development and transport is one of them. So even if I'm talking today about what we are doing in Germany, so we have a very strong interest also to interact with other countries and learn from each other. And at GIZ, we also understand ourselves as a knowledge broker and helping to share knowledge here. I have a few slides, and the first one, if you could link to the next one, shows what happened in Germany when the corona crisis arrived in our country. So basically, so the first cases were reported in January, but so then only very slowly developed, while only in early March, then big super spreader events led to the fact that we suddenly had an exponential growth of COVID-19 crisis. So the government decided on March 16 to shut down. And here you see the transport activity in terms of hour per day. So this here you see that around early March, we had people moving about 1.5, 1.6 hours a day. And then after the lockdown, the movement went down dramatically to minus 50%. And so then much less. And this is especially due to public transport, which is a light gray transport mode. And to some extent also to car transport as people were staying at home, while at the same time walking and cycling and very short car trips went up in the statistics. So we can see here what happened with the lockdown. The next, so then this went up slowly again. And we are now in a more relief situation. However, so in Germany, we would like to link this as well now, the reaction on it and the crisis reaction. So when we trying to start the recovery out of this, and many transport organizations, but also all the other business, basically all the business have been affected. And this is really a dramatic crisis, which never happened before, that everybody is affected to the same extent. So now we need a reaction on this, but we at the same time, we still have the climate crisis in front of us. And the transport greenhouse gas emissions, they have been a major concern of the German government, because you see here in this graph, these are the total emissions in tons CO2 per year. That basically, despite our ambitious climate goals, we have not been able to reduce the transport emissions substantially. So there is now a very ambitious target for 2030 in the German Climate Action Program to reduce transport emissions by -42% against 1990 levels. So which is really about 60 megatons a year less than in 1990, and we are basically still on that level. Now, within the Corona crisis and transport went down, as you saw on the first slide, of course, also transport emissions went down quite a lot. But I would refuse to say this is good news, because this is not really an effect of long-term and sustainable policies, but this has been an effect of an economic crisis. And we want to, of course, have sustainable transport. And this means that we need to take measures that enable us to have better transport with less emissions and a high impact here. So even if you would assume that we are now on track to the target, of course, there would be a big risk now if we just return back to normal to just increase the emissions in the next years, and even so to maybe increase even higher and stop many processes that have been started. And one example here is public transport. Because we have been quite successful in Germany to increase the ridership of public transport in the last years. The government invested billions of euro into subsidizing efforts, improving the service quality. And so now basically the trains and the buses are almost empty, and people are afraid of moving in these sustainable modes. So we have to take actions here. So very few weeks after the crisis started, discussions about the recovery started. And the next slide shows now the reaction of the German government. So 2 weeks ago, the German government announced a 130 billion euro recovery package that is a stimulus package, which has never been before in Germany to the same extent. And this package outlines short-term immediate measures to boost consumption, speed up recovery, and it's equivalent to 4% of the GDP, in fact. So if you see, it's almost a quarter of that is referring to sustainable mobility and or hydrogen. Hydrogen is also related to that aspect, maybe 20% on transport. And so there have been short-term measures that should now stimulate to do this. So to read out, one important decision was taken to really increase the support for electric cars. And I think that's an important decision that we are trying to use the crisis to take the opportunity that in future electric mobility will gain more attraction in Germany. We were struggling quite a lot, but now with the additional incentives from the government, so there's really hope that people start buying the electric vehicles instead. This includes also charging infrastructure, so there's a major boost into this area. Then, of course, I already mentioned public transport, so modernization and expansion of railways still is on the agenda, and also financing the local public transport. And the recovery package, even if it's forward directed and directed investments into the future, it also includes short-term help for the local public transport providers to enable them to survive, because they are really suffering at the moment from less income from ticket sales, and it's a major danger that these companies really have to cut back their emissions. So having said this, and outlining that also in other sectors like in truck and bus fleet modernization, aircraft and ship fleet modernization, there are issues. I'll come to my last slide. And so this is that, of course, I mentioned in the beginning, is that we all in Germany, this is only the start, and we need to continue to learn from each other how to react on the crisis. So for us as the German international cooperation, it's very important to keep track on what other countries are doing, and this is why I think such a webinar is so important. Thank you for the organizers to putting this on the agenda. We need to share our experiences and to talk to each other, because nobody knows exactly which measure is really the most effective one. And we need to have a very short-term success and impact evaluation of this. So what we did as GIZ, we contributed to this discussion with a series of experts exchange webinars, a big conference on COVID-19 reaction on May 26th happened, which was called TUMI, Transformative Urban Mobility Initiative TV. And we're also publishing on the websites quite a number of stories on impacts on this one. However, we have operations in our partner countries, and we are working actively together with ministries of transport, with ministries of environment, to look at the situation and find tailor-made solutions. And here, I would like to really encourage everybody to take part in these discussions. Next week on Wednesday, we are going to have a webinar for our Asian countries with decision makers from environmental and transport ministries on how to react on this. And I think there's a good chance to continue the discussion in also small breakout groups on a very small scale, having experience exchange between this. So please get in touch with us if you're interested in participating in these type of events. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bongard. So we are now moving to our discussant of this panel. I would like to invite Mr. Konstantinos Alexopoulos, Chief of the Transport Facilitation and Economics Section of UNESE, for his remarks. Mix Alexopoulos, and apologies for the way I'm pronouncing your name. Please, you do have the floor.
Thanks, Nayara, very much, and apologies for my name, actually, because it's quite difficult. So, dear colleagues, good morning and good afternoon from Geneva. I am Kostas, and I'm working for Sustainable Transport Division of UNEC. It is a great pleasure for me to participate at today's webinar, and I would like to thank the Under Secretary General Liu, Nayara, Julie, and our colleagues from DESA for giving me this opportunity. My intervention will be quite short, and I will focus on the lessons learned from the measures imposed during the pandemic, as well as on the initiatives being undertaken from the Sustainable Transport Division of UNEC for the next day. The lessons learned from the immediate and short-term responses, measures taken by the governments, show that the transport industry was not really prepared for such living and operating conditions that the pandemic created. Implementing policies like Stay at Home, which created increased need for consumption and 365 degrees turn to business, cannot be accompanied by closing of borders or imposing a series of restrictions to truck drivers. This combination created disruption of international supply chains and therefore shortages in food, important supplies, and medicines. Also, the imposing of different measures, restrictions, and policies in different time frames by the governments brought to light the absence of an agreed protocol to be implemented for rail and transport, at least, during pandemics, and the lack of international coordination. Furthermore, the day after the lockdown and the implementation of the social distancing measures puts at risk the results that sustainable transport policies implemented in recent decades brought. Less use of public transport, increased use of private cars, increased circulation of delivery vans as a result of the increased use of e-business are some of the examples that are being observed. The risk of a return to the transport patterns of 80s and 90s with the known results for the environment, the traffic, and the societies comes to attention. Now, as the Sustainable Transport Division of UNEC, being the custodian of 59 UN inland transport conventions and legal instruments, we are working on 4 main areas to address these issues. First, we have created a multidisciplinary interagency group and also an observatory on border crossing status due to COVID-19, which includes data from more than 150 countries with measures implemented, with the scope to create concrete recommendations in the form of a protocol concerning the response of inland transport during emergencies, including pandemics, in order to ensure that the governments brought to light, that the governments, the next time that such pandemic will happen, will follow a coordinated manner these good practices, ensuring the least possible impact to their economies and societies. Second, following the recommendations of the above-mentioned group, we will prepare amendments wherever would be considered appropriate by the contracting parties to the relevant international inland transport conventions and agreements that we are administering, including provisions that would ensure international coordination during similar conditions. Third, further promote the electronic versions of our conventions, such as the ETIR international system and the ECMR, that ensure seamless and contactless border crossing and transport operations. And fourth and final, we have established a member state-led task force to develop green and healthy, sustainable transport principles to ensure that the post-pandemic transport sector is shaped in a more sustainable manner. Thank you really very much for this invitation, and I wish us very good luck to this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Constance, for your intervention. So without further ado, let's go to our second panel. And again, if you are having questions or comments or suggestions, you can use the chat box for this. You can share also information on the chat box. And there is a Q&A box. For the panelists, you can already take a look at the questions that are coming in. And we will have a session to go through the questions as well and interact more with our panelists. So let's start our second panel, which is on impact of COVID-19 on people and planet through the transport lens, implications for response and recovery. We have 2 speakers on this panel and 2 discussants. We would like to remind the speakers that they have 7 minutes for their interventions, and the discussions have been allocated 2 minutes to speak. So the first speaker, I would like to invite Mr. Yang-Tai Kim, Secretary General of the International Transport Forum at the OECD. Mr. Kim, you have the floor, and please do let us know whenever you want your slides to move. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. This is a really difficult question and moment. So I think at this stage, we cannot really find a solution for everybody. But what is important is to collect the new dimensions to take into account. And we might have a time to wrap up and summarize several times later with all the information collected by all of us. So next slide. So I summarized the impact of COVID-19 on transport and travel, and already the numbers tell. I brought several examples, but basically the specific number doesn't mean a lot these days, because all the people already feel that and know that, and the difference of numbers is not really the meaningful at this stage. But nevertheless, as you see on the screen, we have a very serious the problem today in every society on the globe, and ITF estimates the global passenger transport will drop by 16% on average in 2020, with the highest impact on international transport. We all know that we are now have a lot of difficulty in visiting other countries. Even I'm stuck in Paris without being able to visit my own country, Korea. So next slide. So what have we learned so far? Basically, we didn't really consider a new factor, the health factor, when we discussed the transport issues, but this really changed the mainstream, the perception and thinking today, because we usually thought that connectivity was a really good thing, and the theme of the ITF Summit last year was the connectivity. So how we try to promote connectivity was a question that was regarded as very positive by international communities. But now we can say that connectivity sometimes can be dangerous when it comes to the propagation of the virus, or when we become exposed to a new threat that we do not know at this stage. And also, we had a kind of the fixed idea that public transport is really good. And based on my experience of working in the Ministry of Transport in Korea, I also encouraged people to use more public transport, and saying that we have to reduce the use of private cars to enhance, the green the society, and to save energy and etc. But now public transport is also a medium through which the virus can be propagated and spread. So at some point recently, some governments encouraged people to use private car rather than public transport from the safety perspectives. So I would say now public transport is good, but conditionally good. So if we can guarantee the public transport in terms of the safety and security and sanitary aspects and a lot more. So we have to think about now conditions attached to public transport at this stage. And also importance of transport in the economy. Now we feel that we experience a lot of disruptions. So all the industries like airlines and airports are directly touched by this crisis. And all the travel agencies and hotel industry, restaurant industry, and even, maybe beer companies. I don't know if they drink a lot of beer at home, but because we reduced the human contact, human meetings, we are strongly affected by our problems these days. But nevertheless, we learned that there is a positive discovery. And during this crisis, some transport sector, the companies, they contributed to the society in various ways. So, for example, in France, the national train company SNCF, they transported the patients from one region to another, and we used a drone to monitor the lockdown situation or deliver some goods to remote areas and etc. So I think, nevertheless, we found some positive things during this crisis. So next, please. And now it's an impact of COVID-19 on people. So a lot of people already talk about new normal after the COVID-19 crisis. Most of us now stay at home. So we call it, we have more flexibility in work. So we telework and we teleconference, and also we have more flexibility in transport. So less travel and more personal mobility devices and etc. So that's the reality that we are facing today. So how our new normal can be defined should be discussed more, because it's too early to define it right now. But nevertheless, we feel that every day we have new things, more at the speedy way. And also people now prefer contactless travel because they want to avoid the human touch. And we prefer having machine-oriented approach and digitalization, and etc. But I think this kind of tendency will continue even without the COVID-19 crisis. But the rhythm can be accelerated a little bit. And awareness of the importance of personal sanitary measures, that's really the important thing. And I think it's not only the question in the transport sector, but overall in the society, we become aware of the invisible threats coming from here and there. So next, please. And now, what should we do during this recovery period? I don't know, we can call this recovery period already, because we are still afraid of having the second peak or the second, the question and problems and etc. But nevertheless, according to the World Bank and other international transport communities, we have 4 factors to consider when you talk about the sustainable mobility: the economic aspect, green aspect, and inclusive aspect, and safe aspect. But when it comes to the term safe, this used to be rather a mechanical notion. The safety and security coming from external threat and safety coming from internal threat. But now a sanitary dimension should be added. So basically, I don't remember ITF and transport community really worked closely with the WHO in terms of the virus issues and etc. But now is the time to open the relationship with them. An effective public-private partnership is really important. We know that this is like the phrase in the textbook for the transport community, but we can feel that important strategy in terms of resilience. When something happens, when something wrong happens, we need to restore it quickly. So resilience is really important, and also intermodality is really important. So the connection between different modes of transport, sometimes some modes belong to private sector and some modes belong to public sector. So how we combine those two things are really important. So we need a balance between public and private roles in the society. And also respacing cities are very, very important, because even though we have a new mobility devices, our infrastructure, existing infrastructure, can accommodate it or not. That should be also discussed. And reasonable regulations and deregulations is a very important topic today. So now that's my imagination, but I stayed at home for 55 days without, going out in a normal situation. But I felt that our air was really clean and fresher than before, and I realized that the mother nature also needs to take a rest. And I think this is the moment for us to realize that we can achieve our goal as we plan if we have a proper plans in the future. So I think we have to continue with hope. Having hope is really important. The next one, the final one, I guess. This is just to share that information that ITF is now focusing on. So ITF is a global platform to share information, and we have a special section on our website, and we try to exchange a lot of information in real time with international partners and etc. So if you go there, then you can download a lot of policy briefs and analysis from ITF and related measures that our member countries use. So that's all I prepared for you. Time is not so much, but nevertheless, what is important is to have hope, and we can continue to work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kim, for your presentation. And next, I have the pleasure of inviting Ms. Madhusha Kardama, Secretary General of the Partnership on Sustainable Low Carbon Transport, SLOCAT, to speak. Ms. Kardama, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Nayara. I'm the Secretary General, distinguished delegates, dear colleagues, dear friends from DESA. Thanks very much for this opportunity. And Dr. Kim, a pleasure to share a panel with you once again. Particular thanks, of course, to DESA, to Julie, to Shantanu, to Lot, to Nayara, for pulling this very topical event together and allowing us to also shed a light on the importance of transport and mobility at pandemic peak and as a vector for socioeconomic recovery. So my thanks go to all of you, and my admiration to the countries who have been showing us the measures that they are intending to do, and certainly to the ITF and the UNICEF colleagues for all the efforts they've been making over the past months to try to put, resources at the service of the sector. So I'm going to talk first about impact and then about what does it mean for the response. A lot has been said about the impact, and I think I could be repeating a lot. Perhaps I'm going to try to go a bit faster than what I thought I could on impact. But I think that much of what this pandemic has showed us in the transport and mobility sector are things that we already knew, but that perhaps we were not looking into as much as we wanted, or on which action was not occurring at the pace at which we wanted. So we have seen how essential transport is for people. It's a matter of access. It's a matter of right to mobility, access to socio-economic opportunity. And when it comes to transporting goods to freight, it's about supplies. It's about staying supplied, particularly in the globalized supply chains that were mentioned by the other Secretary General. And also, in moments in which we are all buying online much more than what we were doing earlier. And it has also been mentioned how the pandemic has showed us the fragility of our socioeconomic systems, and transport and mobility is one of those socioeconomic systems. A lot has been said about public transport and the stigma that somehow can now take us to all go back to our cars, isn't it, and the risk that entails. I think that perhaps we have not paid enough attention yet to the notion of informal transport, how in many big capitals and secondary cities in low income and middle income countries, transport services are provided in an informal manner because there is no public transport. And it's the private sector who is running those. And because they are at loss, they are not making any revenue out of them, these informal transport services are disappearing. And in the absence of a formal public transport to actually fill that gap, then what is left for people in terms of accessing their jobs or accessing the socioeconomic opportunities in general. I think that perhaps it's also worth mentioning to what extent this pandemic has shed a light on the fragility of the business model of some mobility systems like the micromobility, the kick scooters, or the electric bike shared systems that we see populating the cities in the past couple of years, like really tremendously, like mushrooms, to different private sector-driven operations, really populating our cities at a very, very fast pace. And I think that last but not least, what we have seen as well, to end with a note of hope on the impact, is that mobility patterns, so behavioral change, can occur very, very rapidly. Our mobility patterns can actually change much faster than what we thought they could. Somehow we all hope, of course, that they would have not had to change because of the reasons why they have changed. But certainly, behavioral change is possible. And perhaps right now we have more willingness than ever to embrace that behavioral change. And we expect more than ever from national and from some national governments policies that would actually help us to embrace that change and go into more sustainable and lower carbon mobility patterns for all of us. A lot has been mentioned about the tactical urbanism measures that we have seen, the pop-up bikes lanes that we've seen, for instance, in cities like in Lima or in Bogota or in Indian cities, or reclaiming the street space for better walking, quieter walking, and for that social cohesion. We have seen a lot of that as well in Kigali, for instance, or in London, for an example. So what are the implications for this? In terms of where should the money go? Where would the policy frameworks need to take us? What are the governance issues that perhaps we would need to pay attention to? Well, let me share with you, colleagues, just a few thoughts. I think that in terms of the monies, the national stimulus packages and the international funds that the international finance institutions and also the bilateral cooperation are going to be putting out there, or are already actually unfolding, have a lot to do. We have high expectations, I think, from the sustainable low carbon movement for those stimulus packages. Is an opportunity that can actually lock us in or almost derail us from decarbonization and equity objectives, or actually help us go into that longer term transformation that we've always been wanting to look into and to unfold. Somehow we need those monies to help put all modes of transport on a decarbonization pathway. Very mindful, of course, of the element of a just transition in terms of jobs that is very central to any transformation of the mobility sector. I think that we also expect those monies to help unleash investment in green and low carbon and resilient mobility infrastructure at scale, and do it as well in low and middle income countries. I think that we have also got expectations about the market signals that these stimulus packages and these international funds could be providing. By market signals, I mean incentivizing clean technology in urban transportation, for instance, or in freight, that it does exist, or sending signals to the manufacturers that there is actually demand out there for producing low emission vehicles for both passenger and freight. And last but not least, those stimulus packages and those international financial frameworks, we believe that should also pay attention to the access by local and regional governments to those monies. Local and regional governments who are sustaining on their shoulders the burden of operating public transport systems, the transport authorities, right now at a loss, and actually having to increase the frequencies even more than what they were doing before with less users, in order to keep physical distance measures and crowd control measures that are so needed, or introducing very modern IT technology for demand management or for card swapping and payment that they didn't have, and therefore there is an upfront investment that they're going to have to be doing. And these are the same local and regional governments who in many occasions have pledged to replace the fleets that run on internal combustion engines by electric fleets, for instance, for the buses or for the metro. So there is a moment there that we have to be very conscious about. What else? What else are some of the, in terms of the policy signals that we could be sending in these responses? I think that more than ever, we need to champion what in the transport and mobility sector we call the avoid, shift, and improve framework. It's about avoiding unnecessary trips. It's about shifting to lower carbon emission mobility modes. And it's about, of course, improving the efficiency of vehicles and of fuels. And there is a hierarchy. First, you avoid as much as you can. You shift to better modes, and then you improve. Then comes the vehicle and the fuel efficiency of that vehicle. More than ever, we have to balance that out, to champion a balanced approach, and to make sure that we don't play the different modes against each other. Some colleagues now that have heard me saying in the past weeks that we certainly cannot play walking modes and public transport modes against each other. That's going to be pretty important. And there is a lot to do about better aligning spatial planning and transport planning, about really supporting subnational governments in the vehicle access regulations in cities, or about harnessing for the longer term projects all the different active mobility measures that we have seen popping up in a transition at the peak of the pandemic. And a word about policy coherence as well, particularly to talk about something that our colleague Daniel Bongard introduced, that measure, that look at the longer term in terms of the climate change. It is a very important year, 2020, in which, in the framework of the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change, countries are expected to submit the nationally determined contributions and tell us the specific measures that are going to be put in place to curb emissions in the horizon of 2025. There's another set of framework documents called the longer term strategies, which look at the 2050. And we think that it's going to be essential that we see a radical increase of the ambition for transport in those documents. And last but not least, let me really have a word for people, really. Governance. We've seen a lot of this behavioral change. We've seen a lot of that willingness to change our behavioral patterns. And we've seen a lot how the private sector is always there to come up with new measures. So building upon what Dr. Kim said, a lot of public-private solutions with public policy oversight and public policy goals are going to be very essential. So thank you very much, colleagues, and obviously back to our moderators. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marusha. We have two discussants, and I'll be really asking our discussants to keep to the 2 minutes because we are seeing questions coming through the chat box, and we want to try to address a few of those. So without further ado, may I invite Ms. Jane Akumu, Program Officer at UNEP. Ms. Akumu, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Nayara. Colleagues and partners, I'll be actually brief. I look at the discussions that have already been ongoing from two perspectives. So the first is at city level and at global level. At city level, what has come out is that there are three trends that are coming out, during this pandemic. The first is that we're seeing more people walking and cycling, and city authorities are already responding to this by putting up more infrastructure for non-motorized transport. The second, as already discussed, is the public transport inadequacies have become more prominent, especially in developing country cities, but also in the developed world. So there's need for additional investment, as already discussed, and measures to make people more comfortable to going back to public transport, because mass transit is key to sustainable transport. Then thirdly, and this is mainly happening in the developing countries, especially in Africa and in Asia, we are seeing an increase in the use of 2- and 3-wheeler motorcycles for home deliveries and also for public transport. So these three measures, coupled with working from home, we've seen a clearing of the skies. That was already noted earlier, that the skies are actually clear because of less pollution. From a global perspective, it's already been mentioned, the international travel restrictions, the decline in the shipping industry, together with the reduction in vehicle use, we've seen a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. As cities, as governments start to reopen their economies, we're seeing countries moving back, going back to pre-COVID situations. However, this is an opportunity for countries to build back better, put up more sustainable solutions. And there are three main reasons, as discussed earlier also, for building back better. The first is sustainable transport solutions are key to almost the achievement of all the SDGs and the Paris Climate Agreement. Secondly, solutions to fast track sustainable transport are already being implemented. We already saw the example of Germany, and other actually countries have included sustainable transport solutions in their economic recovery packages. So this is quite commendable, and I think this should be emulated by more countries and more governments. Thirdly, we already know some of those sustainable transport solutions. For example, at UNEP, we've been supporting and working with countries, especially in Africa and Asia, to eliminate the use of petrol 2- and 3-wheelers and to move to electric mobility. So these solutions already exist and they can be fast-tracked. Just to conclude, I would like to say that to echo the words of Akim Steiner, the Executive Director of the UNDP, that we have choices. Let us make better, more informed choices. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Akumu. Our next discussant is Ms. Alejandra Cruz-Ross from the Transport Officer at ILO. Ms. Cruz, you have the floor, please.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and many thanks to our UNDESA colleagues for the invitation to this webinar. So the discussion points during my intervention will come from an ILO tripartite perspective on workers, employers, and governments and the decent work agenda. Like Mr. Liu said in his introductory remarks, the pandemic impacts in the transport sector have been magnified. So if you look, for example, for passenger modes, they have been severely impacted by restrictions, a slump in demand. This involves aviation, touristic motor coach, cruise ships that have been halted almost to 100%. For urban transport services, there has been business continuity, but workers have unfortunately passed away in the job, and there has been economic costs for operators. In this segment, confidence boosting measures balanced with appropriate physical distancing protection for workers and the public will be key to restart the sectors. In the case of trucking, for example, some segments of the market have been down, but what's crucial is the protection of working conditions and trucker livelihood. In some countries, freight rates have gone down, and while everyone is happy to see their supermarket shelves are stocked, shippers and highway stations have closed bathrooms, access to fresh water, and welfare facilities for truck drivers. Also, a significant challenge in the crisis in the maritime sector has been the issue of crew changes of seafarers, aviation personnel, and other key transport workers. In this sense, IMO, ICAO, and ILO have issued a joint statement urging governments to facilitate the crew changes for seafarers in the context of the pandemic. So the ILO has published a 4-pillar roadmap to combat the economic effects of the pandemic and sectoral briefs on the maritime and transport sector that you can find in the ILO website. My message today is that from the ILO perspective, international labor standards provide tried and trusted policy responses and solutions for a recovery that is sustainable and equitable. It can be expected that the industry will go through changes and perhaps restructure in the following months, so labor standards or tools are not to be jettisoned during the pandemic. In fact, the reverse is true. Labor standards provide key guidance, for example, on occupational safety and health for a safe return to work and protecting frontline workers. Labor standards also help ensuring immediate response reaches all transport workers, particularly those that are at the sharp end of this pandemic, like the informal workers that Marucha was mentioning, migrant women. So to finalize, I would like to say that standards help ensure the immediate response leads to a sustainable economic, social, and environmental recovery. And we cannot and should not treat human rights, labor rights, and climate change separately. And my final question is, what is the future of work we want for the transport sector? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cruz, and I'm glad we have a second webinar next week that we can continue discussing the issues and your questions as well. We are moving now to the interactive discussions. Thanks so much for all who have been uploading your questions on the chat box. I will be inviting our speakers. I have questions for you. If I may, I would like to start with Director General Lee. We have two questions for you, sir. The first one is, do you see investments moving towards greener transport options in the recovery period? And a second one was, what incentives were given to people to adjust their mindset in responding to the pandemic? For instance, wearing masks, taking temperatures, etc. Director General Lee, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I would like to give my personal answer to the second question first. And we didn't have some incentive policy to support people to wear masks like that. People not be there, not be trained to wear masks because they are, I think, because of the awareness of the pandemic. Because we had a bad experience of SARS 2003, and it's very serious, almost as the same. And so because of this bad experience, and the public had the awareness it's very easier to follow the guideline of the CDC guidelines issued by the Chinese government, and such as wearing masks, and even wearing masks is not mandatory in some area, such as me, and also we use this and to protect by myself and protect for other peoples. And so I think this is, of course, it's very important by the government to give the notice and to give the awareness of the public to protect themselves. I think come back to the first question. I think I didn't have any evidence to show we have some more investment in green transport projects. Because investment is long term, but we didn't know, we are not certain how long of this pandemic influence. So we have some short-term impact. Today we discussed the short-term impact of the transport and human behavior like that. And of course, if the pandemic lasts a long time, if we didn't have the specific medicine and vaccine to cure this disease, to control it, we will change the lifestyle, the supply chain, and a lot. So in terms of that situation, we will find some investment become more greener or the traditional investment. But now I'm not sure. I didn't have any information, especially in China. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director General Lee. So I have a question from GIZ, and my understanding is that Mr. Friedel Sechlayer will be able to support with this one. How can we ensure the mobility of workers whose only option is to commute into cities for work? And if you could provide any idea of how the urban mass transport systems are being impacted or changing during the COVID-19. But I would ask you if you can address this in 1 minute.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm replacing Daniel here, who unfortunately had to leave. On the first question, how can we ensure the mobility of people who must travel? I think there's two parts. First one is cities should invest in safe cycling infrastructure. Marusha mentioned that, pop-up bike lanes, so that people who have the chance to avoid public transport can do so by bike or even walking if the distance allows. And the second part, of course, is on the sides of the offices, of the markets, of the work zones, since the demand for public transport is a derived demand. And I think employers could, for example, make employment hours more flexible so that there is no specific rush hour in the morning, so that buses or public transport systems are less crowded. That's one possibility that comes to mind. On the second question that you asked me on the future outlook for mass public transport system, I think the idea that public transport can be financed from fare box or from passenger revenues is a challenge at the moment, showing that more innovative sources of funding need to be found for the operation of public transport. I know an example from London, which has raised its congestion charge now by 30% in order to fill the financial gaps of the London public transport operator. So just as an inspiration of what the city can do to help its public transport system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Frido. We have a question now from Mr. Yang Tai Kin, if you are still with us on the call. And the question is, are you expecting long-term changes in people's behavior that could help the transition to sustainable transport? And then how can government support these changes? Mr. Kin?
Yes, thank you for the question. Very large question, difficult question. But we know that we did a lot of experimentations during this period, and we discovered that a lot of new things can be possible in our daily life. For example, this kind of teleconferencing was not really popular before, but now we are becoming more accustomed to this kind of communication in the cyberspace. And definitely this will have an impact on the people's behavior. But the transport, demand for transport, when it comes to it, it's not really the final the demand, but it's so-called derived demand. So while we go somewhere, it's not really enjoying the transport itself, but is to do something. So now society in general has to be more creative in implementing some innovative measures, how we can touch on non-transport sectors relatively linked to transport sectors to get ready for the uncertain crisis in the future. But definitely the government should have the maximum more dimensions to consider when we try to design new societies. So I think this kind of holistic approach is really important, and at this stage, it's important to collect best practices and best reflections from all the stakeholders.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kin. I have a last question that I wonder if Marusha Kardama would be able to respond. Global emissions from surface transport have declined. How do we keep this momentum? And Marusha, you have 1 minute. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Nayara. Not being fooled by thinking that the momentum is going to be kept because we are already seeing the increase. We are already seeing the return to the private car. And a lot of it is because public transport, as I was saying, is being stigmatized. So the first thing we have to say is debunk myths about the rate of contagion that one can actually have in public transport. I would encourage our participants to go and see what Medellin and Bogota are doing with, say, epidemiologists, looking at what is actually the contamination rate that one can be exposed to in the metro in the city of Medellin, bearing in mind that the air of a metro train gets completely refreshed in 43 seconds, for instance. So I think that another aspect that we can do is very much work across communities. So the transport community working with the health community, working with the behavioral change community. Another thing that perhaps we can do, pointing out what Dr. Kim was just saying, that notion of the 15-minute neighborhood, the 15-minute city that is walkable, that is accessible, that is all about social cohesion, and that people don't need a car because they are serviced around it. And investing in public transport, I'm going to reiterate it again, a lovely study looking at what the chat box has also been bringing us from ECLAC, the Latin American and Caribbean Regional Commission of the United Nations, telling us what would be the cost of inaction. If public transport disappears, what would be the cost for the entire society of that public transport system as a backbone of equitable mobility disappearing. And last but not least, harnessing the non-motorized mobility, the active mobility, breaking that dynamics in which a lot of IFIs think that they are not investing in transforming transformation if they are not investing in very big infrastructure projects, when actually a lot of what I have been seeing at the pandemic peak has been very cost-effective measures that have actually taken shared mobility and sustainable and low carbon mobility very far. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Marusha, and many thanks to all the panelists and speakers. We are moving now to the closing session of this webinar. And for that, I would like to invite Ms. Lotta Tahtinen, Chief of the Outreach and Partnerships Branch at the Division for Sustainable Development Goals at UNDESA for her closing remarks. Lotta, please, you do have the floor.
Thank you, and Nayara and colleagues and all of our wonderful panelists and participants. Thank you so much for your participation and for your very active engagement. We have received a lot of food for thought, and we thank you all for your inputs. Also, I wanted to take this opportunity to mention that in preparation for this webinar, we had circulated a survey to interested stakeholders to complete, to solicit and seek your written responses on some of the topics that have been addressed today. And we thank all of you very much who have responded to this survey. We assure you that your answers will be used for DESA's future work on sustainable transport. And we may get in touch with you to receive more details and information regarding your submissions. So colleagues, without further ado, let me just remind you that the next webinar in this two-part series will be held next week on Wednesday, 1st of July. And the focus of that webinar will really be more on the experiences of countries in special situations and providing some forward-looking transport solutions. We will also be honing in on issues that particularly look at how innovative transport solutions can help accelerate recovery and support achievement of SDGs and climate action, including from the lens of cities. So we very much welcome you to the second webinar next week. And thank you very much for your participation today. The recording and a summary of today's discussions will be made available online. We will also be sharing with you the PowerPoint presentations that have been made. Thank you, colleagues, and we wish you a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you very much, Lotta. Thank you very much, everybody. And many thanks to all colleagues who supported putting this event together, our panelists, our participants. This call is now closed. See you next week.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Lee, bye-bye.